Welcome to Proto-Future, a podcast that asks not what your country can do for you, but why the fuck you should do anything for a country that rejects your existence. This is episode 8, I Heart New York? In this episode, I detail a recent folding bicycle adventure I had up and down the East Coast, and my thoughts on and experience with New York City's new congestion pricing. Some slight programming notes before we begin. It seems Tronald and his goons banned congestion pricing for the moment, but in all likelihood, the incredible popularity of this project will spur a lawsuit and a roaring comeback. The situation is fast developing and changing by the day, but frankly, from what I saw, I think that in the long run, congestion pricing is here to stay and hopefully grow, so I'm writing my episode as if that's the case. Also, this is not the episode I intended to publish today, and I wrote it in a little bit more than a week, spurred on by a fervor of thoughts I had to get out, so I feel it's a little bit less polished than normal and solidly less train-oriented, but I hope it will be entertaining and informative all the same. Anyway, on with the show. In many a previous episode of this podcast, I have hardly hidden my disdain for New York City. I once lived on Wrong Island in Suffolk County for an insufferable 50 weeks, and started applying to graduate school less than 3 months in just to get myself out of that wretched place as soon as possible. That's not to say I only spent my time in Cold Spring Harbor. Moving to the Northeast for the first time, I was compelled to complete my fourth and final corner of the US. Within 5 weeks of moving, in a single day, I traveled from Huntington to the city, took the Acela to Boston, Lakeshore Limited to Albany, and Ethan Allen Express back down to New York just before midnight. My adventures were also local. I rode every line of the New York City subway, Long Island Railroad, Metro North, and weekend operating New Jersey Transit. I thoroughly and almost exhaustively explored and visited museums and attractions, spending nearly every weekend in the city to the point of memorizing every hallway of Old Penn Station. And yes, I even road-tripped a lot by car, making it to every major town on Long Island and driving everywhere from DC to Maine. I was definitely not the bike-pilled rail evangelist I am today, though to be sure, the time I spent there clearly helped make me into it. But this is all to say that, while I may have spent less than a year in the area, I know it quite well. To those who are unaware, much of New York was influenced by Robert Moses, a car-brained, power-hungry, solipsistic bureaucrat who simultaneously held 12 unelected positions for most of his life. The incredibly famous podcast, 99% Invisible, recently completed a year-long reread of Robert Caro's 1,300-page 1974 book, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, about how Moses effectively turned Tammany Hall corruption into modern state DOTs, massively overpatroned by big companies of the car, gasoline, and asphalt varieties, and I highly, highly recommend it to those wishing to learn more, but the gist is that most of New York's modern form of loud, elevated highways, ultra-wide and dangerous boulevards, and rusting steel and crumbling cement was the creation of a man apostolically convinced that the proper way for humans to live was stoic, isolated lives hurtling down a sterile concrete chute in the fetal position surrounded by an expensive, corporatized masculinity-affirming mobile living room. If we can for a second, let's please appreciate my 130-word-long single sentence. Robert Moses was an explicit racist. He unconstitutionally strong-armed impoverished lower classes out of their homes and adorned his parks and recreational structures with bigoted caricatures. It is inescapably well documented that he diverted his highways to run through impoverished areas and used large freeway interchanges to completely obliterate entire majority-minority neighborhoods. He specifically built his highways to prohibit use by public transit, either for buses or rail, and even abused his power as parks director to force highways through communities that didn't want them, sidestepping transportation-based legal challenges by calling them parkways. The absolute worst part, though, is that Robert Moses went on the lecture circuit, spreading his ideas to infuse the practices of DOTs nationwide. Whereas, before his career, transportation bureaus were catching on to the issues of car-oriented planning, with induced demand having been figured out by the Transportation Survey Commission of the City of St. Louis as early as 1930, almost 100 years ago. Now, DOTs were singing the choked and wheezing swan song of the car and making planning-influenced data instead of data-influenced planning, literally falsifying evidence to justify major highway projects in what numerous news outlets have termed highway robbery of the taxpayer. While New York City does have the reputation of being the most urbanist place in North America, along with perhaps Chicago, Toronto, or Mexico City, you shouldn't necessarily mistake it for being a uniformly good place. As I came to understand from all of my adventures, while the population of the metro area is 24 million, the population of the city's 6 boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Hoboken, and Jersey City, because Staten Island doesn't count, is 8.7 million. Thus, 2/3 of all lived New York experiences aren't even in the catchment area of the subways and sidewalks that have made the area so famous. Remembering that Robert Moses was most active in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, most of these suburbs, which make up the majority of the tri-state area's land, mind you, are some of the oldest suburbs in the country. Couple that with suburbia's inherent and proven financial insolvency, and most of these areas have fallen into complete decay. Gravelly and crumbling sidewalks, unmaintained lampposts and fences surrounded by puddles of their own rust, large parkades smothered in decades of brake and exhaust dust, and potholes everywhere. Growing up in suburban Orlando, suburban Miami, suburban Los Angeles, suburban Salt Lake, and suburban Seattle, I learned how wretched and isolating suburban living is, but at least those suburbs were newer and clean. As aesthetically awful as it may be to have acres of non-functional turf grass everywhere, at least it's mowed and empty of trash. But the age of the tri-state area's suburbs extinguishes any charm that could have been indoctrinated for or ability to ignore the financial collapse inevitable to any form of suburbia. And I haven't even touched the transit yet, with its well-documented state of terrible repair, ADA inaccessibility for over 70% of subway stations, bonkersly unintuitive transfers, veritable absence of intersuburban routes, obsession with paper tickets manually checked by car attendants, and least excusable transit deserts on planet Earth. Every other legacy metro system in the world 100 years old or older, Madrid, Hamburg, Berlin, Paris, London, Budapest, and plenty of others, has managed to escape their aged origins and become a sparkling core of a modern rail transit system. Even domestic rivals, such as Boston and Philadelphia, known for their grueling incompetence and rampant corruption, have achieved much the same result as New York with remarkably less effort. This is my favorite fact, and I am not making this up, so I encourage you to fact-check me on this one. The MTA and the subway are so poorly run that the 3-station 2nd Avenue subway extension literally came in 88 years behind schedule and at a final cost of $1 million per foot. At the time I lived there, as good as Midtown and Dumbo are, nothing could make up for the fatigue incurred just by getting around the city. It was a place that was good, not because of itself, but in spite of itself. So, with the stage adequately set, allow me to tell you about my most recent trip. One of my favorite YouTube channels is City Nerd, aka Ray Delahunty. Every week or so, he breaks down some aspects of cities and urbanism, usually in heavily data-driven top 10 lists. As it so happens, according to his analysis of federal ModeShare survey data, State College, Pennsylvania is the most urbanist college town in the US, and the local Catabus, which, may I remind you, now reports to me after I was appointed as a transportation commissioner for the State College Borough, has the 9th highest transit ridership per capita of the whole country, up there with places such as Philadelphia, San Francisco, and, yes, even New York City. It makes sense that my urbanist transformation started in New York was, in fact, completed here. If I hadn't moved to New York, would I have metamorphosed from a light rail and freight train aficionado into a passenger and rail transit evangelist? Probably not. But it's also equally likely that the transmogrification to a bicycling, walkability, and municipal activist wouldn't have happened had I not moved here either. Anyway, I happen to be a member of Ray's Patreon Discord, where we routinely share news, activism tips, and posts mocking car-brained suburbanites. When Ray announced that he was doing a live show at Hunter College with another favorite of mine, the Brooklyn-based War on Cars podcast, we all jumped at the opportunity for a meetup. In fact, we didn't just do that. No, many of us booked the same Amtrak trains headed into and out of Manhattan. I, being from central Pennsylvania, was to take the Keystone to Philadelphia and transfer onto the train north to Moynihan. Right? Well, not quite. I decided to bring along my new Turn Vectron folding e-bicycle, which is absolutely fantastical, not just because folding bicycles fold, but primarily because folding bicycles do not require the covetedly rare bicycle reservation slot on Amtrak and are allowed to be stowed as regular-ass luggage. So, with that in tow, after getting a ride to Harrisburg, courtesy of the friend I sold my car to, loaning it back to me for the weekend, thank you, Kiara, I bicycled around Harrisburg for breakfast, shout out to Elementary Coffee Company, took the Keystone to Philadelphia, took the Northeast Regional to Baltimore, spent the entire day riding transit in bicycling around Baltimore, then went to DC, bicycled around DC, caught the train up to New York City with Discord Urbanist friends, spent 3 days bicycling around New York, caught the NER back down to Philly with Urbanist Discord friends, spent a couple of hours bicycling up and down the Schuylkill River Trail on a layover, and caught the late Keystone back to Harrisburg. So yes, in one weekend I bicycled around more than half of all major Northeast Corridor cities, some of them quite comprehensively. DC was okay. While I was there, I primarily bicycled around mostly non-National Mall neighborhoods to the east of the capital, which I had never been to before, making it to Stanton, Lincoln, Seward, Folger, Providence, Garfield, Marion, and Market Parks. The area had plenty of lanes and a few cycle tracks, but the intersections with light cycles on the order of 100 seconds or more were occasionally oppressive, and there was terrible integration between cycle tracks and sidewalks, sometimes lacking curb ramps entirely, which is not only ADA inaccessible, it precludes the sidewalks from being able to stitch together the mistakes of civil engineers or the network gaps of politicians. When DC was good, it was very, very good. When it was bad, it was horrid. Philly doesn't even enjoy the same faulty attempt at comprehensiveness. As Alan Fisher has noted on many occasions, the Schuylkill River Trail is a literal bicyclist's highway from the burbs to Center City, but unfortunately, it's a pretty solitary investment. As I experienced myself, bicycling to the Schuylkill River Trail from 30th Street Station, which by any reasonable estimations is a solid weak link in the Northeast Corridor for its paltry passenger amenities, urban isolation, and annoying Amtrak queuing, the route for bicyclists to the trail was unsigned, confusing, and had dreadfully few access points. A single missed turn might result in blocks of rerouting just to get to the damned trail. Once you were on the trail, going southbound, it just ended with a chain link fence and a bench in the middle of nowhere. While I am certain city planners intend to extend it someday, the whole thing reeked of a 1980s recreational multi-use trail, not for commuters or travelers, but for people who ran and bicycled for exercise, and simply needed a long, uninterrupted patch of asphalt upon which affluent white people could bodybuild, not actually a useful piece of well-connected multimodal eco-friendly transportational infrastructure. But this was just the trail. We need to address the bike lanes. Through Fairmount Park and into Drexel, the bike infrastructure was sharrows at best, which, science shows, are literally more dangerous than nothing. But that's not the worst of it. On July 17th, Dr. Barbara Fredes, a pediatric oncologist at the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, practically as close as you can get to a living angel, was run over and killed by a drunk 69-year-old near Rittenhouse Square on the Spruce Street bike lane. The Republican mind is inclined to believe this is a case of insufficient individual responsibility on the part of the driver, but in reality, this is a case of structural inequality. The Spruce and Pine Street bikeways have been criticized as poorly designed, lacking any separation from cars beyond paint, and even then, green bikeway paint is applied only at intersections. For all practical purposes, on the blocks between intersections, the bikeways look like any old travel or parking lane. People have been complaining to the city for years about their almost murderous design, and in fact, after almost watching a father and his daughter get run over on a trip this past summer, I myself called both 911 and 311 for that very reason a couple of blocks away a mere 42 days before Dr. Fredes was vehicularly homicided. But Mayor Sherelle Parker and City Councilman Kenyatta Johnson have routinely rebuffed any attempts at traffic calming, pedestrian-oriented streets, or bicyclist safety measures. It is a clear case of truly open and shut murder by infrastructure at the hands of car-brained politicians, and proof positive that suburbanites and people who cater to them are the enemy, and should be treated as such. This was a preventable death, but it happened anyway because of cars and their drivers. Look around at your local community, and I am certain you will find similar deaths that have happened recently and nearby. Do everything you can to end this tyranny of automotive violence. So yeah, I won't ever be moving to Philadelphia. It has extensive regional rail, some light rail, and subway, but it's all just shitty. It has a station on the Northeast Corridor, but one of the more hostile and unpleasant to wait in. And it has bicycle trails and routes, but they're straight-up death traps. It's nice to not be rent-burdened, but it's nicer to not be dead. If you want your city to prosper, don't design things that kill me. Next stop in my travels, Baltimore, and this was the sleeper hit of the trip. From the moment I unfolded my bike on the platform of Baltimore Penn, I was impressed with what I saw. In fact, no, even earlier, an episode I have planned for release in 2034, I once flew to and speed ran Houston for 59 hours, but by flying out of EWR and back through BWI. During my mere hour in the city on that trip, I was blown away by the high quality of their cycling infrastructure, and I made a point to return soon. I am so glad I was able to bring along my bicycle. The cycle track down Maryland Avenue is probably one of the best cycle tracks I have ever ridden, not not even so much for its infrastructural execution as much as its clear centrality to the city as a major commuting artery. While the number of cycling tracks is lacking, the sheer amount of streets with bicycle lanes, or that had been converted into low-traffic bicycle boulevards, as well as healthy supplementation of trails and greenways, made it such that practically anywhere in the city was accessible by bike. Not just accessible, not just easily, not just quickly, but safely. Pivotal to all of these was extensive signage, never letting you go more than a few blocks without reassuring you that you were still on the designated route. While every part of the network could do with some plussing, it still was a network. Imagine if you, hypothetical car-brained listener, who for some reason is still listening despite the fact that I've spent the better part of a dozen episodes haranguing you, wanted a quick and easy trip across town on a highway. But the highway disappeared and reverted to slow surface streets every 2 kilometers, and you needed to pull over and check your phone to manually navigate to the next stretch of highway. That's basically what modern bicycle infrastructure is in far too many American cities at the moment. You get a spectacular, fresh, by-the-book cycle track for only about 6 blocks at a time, often not even master-planned into a someday super network, and instead appended to the streets incohesively as the water main comes due for replacement. It hardly makes it safe, much less quick and easy. The thing that made Baltimore so unexpected was that, for only having a single proper cycle track, you really wouldn't know it for all the extensive bicycle route signage covering the whole damn city. Beyond the punching well above its weight wheeling infrastructure, the street life was incredible. Having been to 46 of the 50 largest cities in the US, I genuinely can't remember the last time I saw so many neighborhoods well outside the city center completely coated with pedestrians, streeteries, shops, and just bustlement. Having previously considered Johns Hopkins for both undergrad and grad, I was decidedly turned off by the drab federalism of the campus. Oh, and the almost Dukean attempts to intentionally gentrify the areas around its campuses and displace the rightful residents of color who actually made the place worth visiting to begin with. And so I had always associated Hopkins with a great quality of education, but a terrible quality of life, brutalist in function, if not aesthetics, barely a half step above downtown Richmond. But in exploring places outside the normal tourist corridors, simply by the happenstance of biking through them, I found so many neighborhoods that were just so cute. Practically everything south of Federal Hill deserves an honorable mention, and gave off the vibes of such incredibly famous colonial neighborhoods as Bunker Hill, but my favorite discovery was easily Hampton along 36th Street. The Shadow Campus neighborhood spared the wrath of Hopkins' ignoble influence by hiding behind the barrier of Wyman Park. Go east and you have the university. Go southeast and you can catch the Maryland Avenue cycle track into the city. Go south and you're on the right-of-way of the old Ma and Pa, converted into a trail and greenway. Go west and you're connected with the light rail, a decently frequent corridor to the faraway north, south, and airport. Go further west and you have the Baltimore Society of Model Engineers, an excellent category of cultural amenity that any aspiring affluent urbanist should look at having in their backyard. And go east and southwest and you have the Wyman and Druid Hill Parks, urban nature oases. It is, of all the places I've ever visited, the single neighborhood I've most coveted living in. It has every possible thing I could ever want, except of course the atrocity that is I-83, not just another in a long line of disgusting urban freeways, but one built immediately over top an otherwise adorable stream, robbing the residents of a third natural refuge. There's a phrase in urban planning, preservation by neglect. Whereas some cities, such as Buffalo and Detroit, dealt with urban decay by razing full districts to the ground, places with even less political influence during the 1970s and 80s, such as Portsmouth or Providence, or hell, even Chicago and New York themselves, places so out of vogue at the time, were in many ways spared the destructive influences of urban renewal by being so crime-ridden that nobody much cared, and a lot of the quaint pre-car streetscapes were left in situ to be later rediscovered and rehabilitated. Baltimore is a type city of such preservation by neglect, and further still, I almost think it benefits from living in DC's shadow. Whereas Richmond is boring and looks to emulate the exact wrong lessons of the L'Enfant Plan, I think Baltimore's bad reputation has let it fly under the radar for a very long time, getting away with things that would be political non-starters in many other American cities. Honestly, in some, as astutely noted on a bumper sticker I found in Hampton, Baltimore, actually, I like it. Now, a short interlude. One of the reasons I spent the day biking around Baltimore was to complete the area's rail transit. I had previously ridden all 2 1/4 lines of light rail, and obviously the Northeast Corridor, aka Mark Penn Line, but to 100% the city to my satisfaction, I needed to ride the Baltimore Metrolink Subway Something Something Green Line from Hopkins Medical to Owings Mills, the city's only and dreadfully pathetic subway, as well as the Mark Camden Line, a commuter rail line going from Baltimore Camden, not Baltimore Penn, to DC Union, shadowing the Northeast Corridor via a different route and atrociously fewer frequencies. But, if you'll recall, I was supposed to ride the same train as Discord urbanists from Philly to Moynihan, but riding the Mark Camden line took me all the way to Washington City. So, being mischievous, and in an order of events only slightly forced for sake of humor, I sent a bunch of pictures to the Discord of my trip to Baltimore, asking my one friend, who I would like to emphasize I had met in person before, where they thought I was. They said, Baltimore, and a bit later, I sent, no silly, I'm right in front of you as you exit the WMATA red line, sending pictures to corroborate. It was a slightly beautiful and amusingly unhinged moment, if a touch stalkery, I do admit. Anyway, from there, we took the train to Moynihan Station in New York City. Alongside Baltimore, it was a trip of spectacular discoveries. Now, to those unaware, New York City has been in an intensely contentious decadal battle to be the first North American city to enact congestion pricing, something which I emphasize has been around for many, many, many years in many other developed countries. The gist is thus: traffic is awful, in Manhattan more so than most other places, so why not have people pay a toll, not just to take a portion of a road, or a certain road, but all roads. In essence, provide a nudge, so that people willing to take transit for their trips will do so rather than pay the toll, and those unwilling to take transit will, while paying the toll, be rewarded with more freely flowing roads. Congestion pricing is a classic example of a Pigouvian tax. Driving is a moral ungood, which causes lots of harm not fully captured by the marginal cost on the car's owner of their driving, such as the cost of the time wasted to other people by you being the traffic in their way, the cost of the medication to treat the lung cancer you give innocent bystanders, and, of course, the cost of lost GDP from the lifetime of productivity you robbed the economy when you ran over that innocent vulnerable road user because checking Instagram was a more important use of your time while operating licensable heavy machinery. These are all termed negative externalities, leading to a tragedy of the commons, where individual people act selfishly to the detriment of the whole. The way to combat this deadweight loss is to tax the people causing the harm in the first place, the drivers. Much like a sin tax on cigarettes, the idea is to charge drivers commensurately with the harm they cast upon others so that they act more rationally, and ideally drive less or never again. Frankly, congestion pricing should be the norm absolutely everywhere for every single road all the time, and term it a road use fee. And in many other cities, it is. Places like London, Singapore, Stockholm, Milan, Bergen, and Oslo. Congestion pricing is even found in small cities such as Durham, England, Znomo, Czechia, Riga, Latvia, and Valletta, Malta. I cannot emphasize enough how much the US is behind the rest of the developed world here. We are rapidly losing our first world status, if not having already lost it for decades. Anyway, this is relevant because my very first few moments out of Moynihan, having unfolded my bicycle and walked it through the renovated halls of Old Penn Station just past midnight on a Thursday, I was accosted with Midtown Manhattan and its incredible calm and quietness. Having been in, out, and through that station 100 times before, at all times of day, I was completely unprepared for how unlike it was to all of my previous experiences. I know this city, and I, for the life of me, found it unrecognizable. There was little to no honking. There were no sirens, because there were no cars to be told to get out of the way of the emergency vehicles. And then, better yet, there was a high-quality, Jersey barrier-protected cycle track just a block away from the station. It even had its own bicycle-specific stoplights that were timed in green waves up 6th Avenue at the speed of bicycle, not the speed of car. Furthermore, throughout the city, there was comprehensive and regular wayfinding signage for bicycle routes, routinely reminding you where you were going and whether to turn left or right to get to major destinations or a different neighborhood. It was hardly perfect. A few major gaps still remain, not the least of which being the inaccessibility of the subway network, making it difficult to use the subway as a bicycling fast forward. But I think it's the best and most comprehensive cycling network I've seen or heard of, much less directly experienced, anywhere in North America at the moment. And all of this I interpolated from just my very first few minutes in the city. The rest of the trip did not stop impressing. On my first full day there, I started in Queens Plaza at my hotel, biked all the way through Astoria to the Hellgate Bridge, then down the waterfront to the Socrates Sculpture Park, over to and completely encircling Roosevelt Island, back to Queens, through Long Island City, around Hunters Point, over the Pulaski Bridge to Greenpoint, along the waterfront to Domino Park, through Williamsburg, along Kent, and past Steiner Studios to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. At this point, I headed back to Queens Plaza, stashed my bike in the hotel room because that's something you can do when it folds, freshened up, and subwayed over to the City Nerd and War on Cars live show for a spectacular evening meeting with a dozen fully incredible people partying long into the night. The next day, I rode back down to the Navy Yard, over to Dumbo, under the Brooklyn Bridge, beneath the Heights, around the Columbia waterfront, down Red Hook, over Gowanus, completely encircling Prospect Park, back over Gowanus, on the water taxi, completely encircling Governor's Island, back on the water taxi, into Fidei, around the Battery, up Battery City, over to Broadway, through Soho, and into the Bowery, before subwaying it back and spending a wonderful, if loud, evening at Tourst in Williamsburg. On my final day, I packed everything onto my bicycle, headed up to Astoria again, overtop the RFK Bridge to Randall's Island, over the Bronx Kill, into Mott Haven, through the South Bronx, past Foster Park, over the High Bridge to Manhattan, along the Washington Heights, through Upper Manhattan to Hamilton Grange National Monument, through West Harlem to the Ulysses Simpson Grant Memorial, through Morningside Heights, into Harlem, down Central Park, stopping briefly for dinner in the Upper West Side, then back to Central Park through Times Square, and finally arriving at Moynihan Station to meet fellow urbanists and chat the whole way home. Beyond that rapid-fire itinerary, I did more things and have a few more thoughts, some of which I'll annotate here. When biking over Sunnyside Yard on my first day, I caught what I believe was an early Empire service going through a train-sized car wash. It's nice to know that Amtrak still does that and cares about cleanliness. In Astoria, I encountered positively gigantic cycle tracks, 50% or more wider than a typical car travel lane, and painted with green thermoplastic along its entire length, a welcoming piece of cycle infrastructure indicating where their priorities lay. However, not all was fantastic. Bike lanes were blocked by parked cars and double-parked freight vehicles more often than I could count. Whereas some cities have great bike lane discipline but far too little cycle infrastructure, New York is the epicenter of the bike versus solipsistic idiot culture war. I have been to Roosevelt Island before, but only via the touristy tramway. My major issue with the island is that it's too residential and lacks a commercial core. I can't imagine going there to see a neat bar or restaurant, and if I were to live there, I'd imagine all my neighborhood bars and restaurants would actually be in the Upper East Side. So as neat as it is that there's a secret sixth borough, in practice it was just blah. A destination for the aerial tramway at which you could spend a few minutes before hopping back over to Manhattan. This time, however, I genuinely think the island was made for the speed of bicycle. It didn't take too long to traverse, barely 6 minutes top to bottom if I put my mind to it, but having a bicycle effectively flattened and shrunk the community, making it easier and faster to string together its otherwise diffuse parts. From the peculiar island-wide park and ride appended to the bridge from Queens, to the incomprehensibly stunning views from every corner of the promenades, Roosevelt made so much more sense on a bicycle. And the Four Freedoms Park at the southern end was fundamentally moving, not for the views, but for what you saw when you looked back at the island. It was pleasantly unexpected. Continuing back along the Queens and Brooklyn waterfront, I was specifically impressed by how much had been converted to beautiful modern parks, equal parts unkempt nature, preserved but rejuvenated decay, and hyper-modern aesthetic. I don't at all remember from my time living there that much of the waterfront being converted into so many sophisticated public parks. Perhaps my memory is fully in error, and it was that way all along, but at least to me it feels improved, like it's better, more master-planned than ever before. There were actually many points where the parks abruptly ended in tarpaulined chain-link fences with an empty industrial lot beyond, indicating the city clearly intended for the park to continue onward at a future date. So the city clearly is one still in transition, supporting my perspective that not quite near as much of this was here before. But you can only commend the municipal officials and those who voted them in for having a vision for a city that had been so sorely lacking for so many years. Some of the best parts were the innumerable piers with lounging benches at their point, providing unparalleled views of the city. Gantry Park, which rehabilitated railroad car float gantries into industrial art, and my absolute favorite, Domino Park. This one is hard to describe, but there are two giant bucket cranes rehabbed in a brilliant light cyan blue, and a winding pathway around their supports up to and along the facade of a former warehouse, and then downstairs to the ground again. Partnered with this exquisite adult playground was an ultra-modern children's playground of matching cyan, silver, and yellow, and depicting almost grain silo-esque yet homunculi accessible industrial architecture. Frankly, it's the standard for what urban playgrounds should look like going forward. The next day, my first stop was Propel Bikes, a bike dealer and online supplier with a famous YouTube channel and physical locations in Brooklyn, Delaware, Long Beach, and most recently Detroit, specializing in exquisite customer service and aesthetically unmatched reviews of bicycles for urban folding and cargo functions. I had long followed them, but that day I needed a top-off of chain lube and wanted to order a few more things, so I made absolutely certain to stop by. After 2 hours of chatting with the shop's attendants about things like my experience with and the merits of my Vectron, the quality of certain brands, and the differences in e-bike culture from the East Coast to the West, I was able to fit in a test ride of 3 cargo bikes I was looking into as a car replacement bicycle. While I'm certain I will have much more to say on the subject in the future, here are my thoughts for the moment. Tern, spelled Tango Echo Romeo November, the manufacturer of my folding bicycle, has a bunch of compact long-tail electric cargo bikes, capable of easily being stowed vertically due to a genius integrated rack on the rear with pegs for standing upright and handlebars that fall down nicely out of the way. Longtails are effectively regular bicycles, but longer and with a beefier frame for carrying the extra weight of passengers, pets, cargo panniers, or other attachments behind the rider. The experience of riding the longtail was quite unique. Everything you touched and saw in front of you was like a regular bicycle, but when you tried to turn, it's like you were dragging an anchor behind you because the wheelbase was so elongated. On the other end of the spectrum are the Bachfiets, or box bikes. These place a large open tray, barrow, or box of variable height in between the handlebars and the front wheel. The two I tried were both the Riesenmuller Load 4, one each with a 60 or 75 centimeter barrow bed. Coming in at a whopping $10,800 for a full build-out, these were genuinely the smoothest, suavest, and best designed bicycles I've ever ridden. All the more impressive when you consider that it costs only as much as the options on a new car. However, with an eye-watering length of 2.65 meters, the Load 4 is truly a beast. It felt to bicycle much as I imagine a container ship feels like to sail, with the full length of the large bed to my front. The most unexpected part, though, was that it gave off weird sensations for the typical cyclist. Seeing as there is a regular-sized bicycle wheel in the back giving off a normal amount of gyroscopic righting force, you expect the front wheel to give off a similar amount of resistance when you try to turn it. However, given that Bachfiets have a smaller front wheel operated by an actuator to accommodate the size of the box, there is much less gyroscopic momentum than you're expecting, and I found myself dramatically over-pushing the handlebars. This is obviously something that will come to correct itself naturally with time. It is, after all, just like riding a bike. But for the test rides, I found myself weaving side to side down the road like a drunken sailor being knocked about on the high seas. Conversely, though, the sheer size of it made me feel much more confident in taking a whole automobile lane and earned me more respect from my adjacent motorists. Overall, the Load 4 was an incredible machine that I dearly hope I may own someday. In the meanwhile, though, I'll just have to stick to transporting 4x8 foot sheets of plywood home on my regular bicycle, which, mind you, I have in fact done successfully. Anyway, having test-ridden my first Bachfiets, I headed back out on the town, first going over to Dumbo, or down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, to get some pictures of it, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the world-famous skyline, then following the many and wonderful waterfront parks all the way down to Red Hook. After looping around Prospect Park, I, for my first time ever, rode New York's water taxis. I am unaware of another city in the Western Hemisphere with such an extensive water taxi network, possibly because so few have such a close relationship to such extensive waterfronts. The particular route that I took to and from Governor's Island ran, I believe, hourly, so it's nothing like an actual transit artery as I would understand it, but the directness of the route along the coast almost made up for the poor headways. That, and I was also traveling to a literal island. It really would be interesting if more cities, especially ones with urbanized bays and rivers, embraced water transit as a more viable option and made it as high quality as any other transit service, as is the case with Vancouver's Seabus, with headways every 15 minutes. Governor's Island itself was fine, but not great. There were a bunch of what I'm assuming were old military operations built around the historic forts, but instead of decaying or being preserved, they seemed to still be in active use, leading to an unappealing government-industrial feel. There were nice elements of nature here and there, and some spots to hang out for a picnic, but it needed much more work to match its counterpart public spaces on the East River. I do need to return someday to hit the Battery, because it was closed once I got to Manhattan before I could get my National Park Service cancellations, and oddly enough, I've actually only ever visited Ellis Island from the Jersey side. Back on the, mainland, I was once again blown away by the quality of the cycle infrastructure in Fidei and Battery City. Not only were there long, wide, beautiful, and well-signaled cycle highways through the heart of the city, protected from major roads by foliaged embankments, when there was construction, bicycle detours were built out of temporary water-filled Jersey barriers, rather than just ending the cycle track and dumping its users onto a sidewalk as would be done anywhere else in America. New York, post-transformation, treats bicycles as equally valid, equally important users of the city, and seems to genuinely put thought into their well-being. It is a way of thinking that is so un-American, which by extension makes it good. On my last day, I wanted to hit the High Bridge, which I had passed many times on Metro North beneath, but had never been on, so a sojourn to the Bronx was in order. To get there from my now just checked out of hotel in Queens necessitated a ride north through Astoria and over the RFK Bridge. One of many ugly monstrosities built by Robert Moses, this, in contrast, did not at all prioritize bicyclists. The southern end of the bridge wasn't even ADA accessible, requiring you to push your bike up 4 flights of stairs through a series of metal chutes to carry the wheels over the steps. It is a truly hostile design meant to remind you that the bridge was built for cars, not people, and the on-bridge experience isn't much better, with the pedestrian walkway being elevated both over the water to the east, but also elevated over the cars to the west, with nothing but a terrifyingly low fence on either side prepared to knock your knees and send you tumbling over into the water or traffic. It was also, as is most car infrastructure, heinously loud. However, there is one minutely redeeming feature. It sits on the west side of the spectacular Hellgate Bridge, the gateway built by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad in 1917 to give Long Island, Penn Station, and Point South an uninterrupted connection to southern New England and Boston. Today, it is part of Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, and while known for its dramatic 310-meter, two-hinged steel arch span which later inspired the Sydney Harbor Bridge, it's known almost as much for its dramatic 5-kilometer viaducts leading up to the bridge over the Bronx and Queens. Through pure happenstance, while I was on the RFK, I decided to look up on my rail fanning softwares where the next Amtrak train was, and wouldn't you know it, a southbound Acela was due in just 3 minutes. Miraculously, I took what I deem the coolest, smoothest video of my life, watching America's first and only true high-speed train wind its way around the viaduct, cross the East River on this gorgeous monument to engineering, and then pick up speed to soar along the rooftops near LaGuardia. It was a spectacular and gorgeous experience, well-nigh religious, if a bit excruciatingly freezing with my bare hands open to the frosty winter gusts dozens of meters in the air for 3 minutes. When Acela 2031 receded out of sight, I literally did fist pumps and started yipping at how cool the moment was. Back down on the ground on Randall's Island, I made a point to detour by the Bronx Kill, which I believe Preston and Child described quite floweringly in their book Reliquary. Then onto the streets and up the Bronx I went. Overall, the bike infrastructure there was still almost as good as the rest of the city, but more reliant on door-zone bike lanes, and there was a lot less respect for not parking in the bike lane, with sometimes literal dozens of cars blocking the lane in a single kilometer. Foster Park in the Bronx was an unexpectedly enchanting place, with steep bluffs to the west making a fascinating multi-layer view of skinny, tall, old, greebled brick apartment complexes going up the hillside, the closest I've seen in the real world to the Franklin and South Manchester, or the Grand Street and Three Rivers. Truly haunting for how the views draw you into an urban fantasy world, and absolutely on my list to visit again someday. Then I got to the High Bridge, a Victorian aqueduct bringing water from upstate into Manhattan with a pedestrian promenade on top. It makes a great rail fanning location for the perspective it gives of Metro North, similarly being one of a very few real-life locations that genuinely looks like a model railroad scene from the aisle, also well worth a visit. The rest of the trip was fairly uneventful, if absolutely gorgeous, biking through the magnificent neighborhoods of Washington Heights, West Harlem, Morningside Heights, and Central Park. I always enjoy visiting national parks, so I made sure to get my cancellations at Hamilton Grange and the Unconditional Surrender Grant National Monument. Being private gardener of the 3rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Light Artillery, Battery B, it was a mandatory pilgrimage to remember when killing conservatives and wiping clean their way of life from the surface of the earth was a patriotic national pastime and expected duty of citizenship. On my way to Moynihan Station from dinner in the Upper West Side, completely unplanned, the navigation software routed me back through Central Park during dusk, and just as the atmosphere ticked over to night, down new, protected bike lanes through Times Square, all of the lights casting a powerful purple and red glow up and down 7th Avenue. It was a completely unplanned but spectacular end to an already unforgettable trip. As I close up, some people might complain about the expense of living in a city, but to that I'd retort twofold. For one, some things are worth paying for. Cheap is usually antithetical to good, and I would happily cut my take-home pay to have the privilege of living in such a vibrant, dynamic, and now beautiful and well-put-together place. I'm not saying everyone should be of the liquidity to afford Midtown Manhattan prices. Gods know I probably won't be able to ever afford those prices myself, but what I am saying is that how you choose to prioritize the money you do have says a lot about your character, and everybody should strive, as best they can, to live a climate-friendly, equitable, and sustainable lifestyle. Wanting to live in a sprawling suburb is, scientifically provably, not that. And secondly, one of the reasons why New York is so expensive is because there is a national shortage of good cities and urban housing. If you think that you don't want to live in cities because of how expensive they are, I'll note that they are expensive precisely because of the suburban single-family house you live in. You are the problem, so immediately call your representative and tell them you support an expansion of walkable mixed-use zoning and an end to single-family homes. Hopefully, by flooding the market with enough apartments, we can expand their diversity to include flats with model railroad-sized rooms in them. Or, barring that, I'll just have to live in an artist's loft with a great big old choo-choo space. Overall, it's supply and demand. Cities, and especially cities such as this, are expensive exactly because there's such a high and as of yet largely unfulfilled demand for them. One of the many indicators that the US is a failed state of 53rd world countries in a trench coat with mustache glasses is the severe imbalance of urban to suburban housing stock. America largely only allows the construction of suburbia, and yet its own citizens are paying through the nose to get literally anything other than that. Back on that first night, as I traveled north then east to my hotel in Queens, the views that night biking over the Queensboro Bridge were simply stunning. The skyline twinkled in every direction, but the mega-scale industrial claustrophobia of the bridge itself and the richly textured darkness beyond is one of the few moments that I truly felt the pull of an old Gotham City. Its juxtaposition with the hyper-modern metropolis I saw almost exclusively on the rest of the trip was jarring. New York, like many good, adequate American cities at the moment, is a city in transition. It came up from an ugly, corrupt, neglected place, but it's been able to seize the initiative and push forward to make itself the quintessence of a place not done right, but trying to do right. Again, it's still hardly perfect. The subway needs to be modernized to the tune of $1 trillion of work. The dipshit religious Hasidic and Orthodox communities need to be unwelcomed and relocated because evangelical religion is mutually incompatible with equitable and tolerant liberalism, and basically everywhere the tide of automobility still needs to be pushed back to abate the car's war on livability. But having lived in and comprehensively explored this city, for the first time that I've known it, I would say that it's worth living in. The benefits have now outweighed the shortfalls. This has been episode 8 of the Proto-Future podcast, I Heart New York. The theme music is Spark of Life by Benjamin Lazarus through Tribe of Noise. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons Pedro Reyes, Andrew LaVerghetta, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, Linda Eskin, and Roger Coleman. I am very glad I went on this trip, to have seen the beginning of congestion pricing as I did, and I feel honored to have been witness of this incredible, hard-fought, historic event. With any luck, this is the beginning of the end of Robert Moses' legacy, and the end of the beginning of the end of automobile violence and suburban tyranny. If you would like to know more, you can visit the website at www.bgtmrring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf, to listen to the Manifesto and Prologue series, watch the Modern Modeling Clinic anthology, or read the free-to-access Patreon production blog, and please consider donating on a monthly basis to help defer hosting and equipment costs and support what I do. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, Lenni Lenape, Piscataway, Anacostan, Mohican, Munsee Lenape, Canarisi, Wappinger, and Shakticoke peoples. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of central and southeastern Pennsylvania, central Maryland, and southern New York. Thank you very much for listening. Keep riding trains, keep punching Nazis, and keep building a better future. Now, to those unaware, New York has been in an intensely contentious decadal battle to be the first North American. New York has been in New York has been in an intensely contentious decadal battle to be the first New York has been in an intensely contentious decadal battle to be the first New York City in North America. New York City has been in an intensely. New York City has been in an. Maybe it's time that I include after credit bloopers. This really feels like a moment for it. New York City has been in an. New York City has been in an. New York City has been in an intensely contentious decadal battle to be the first North American city to enact congestion pricing. Yay, I got it.